Snow fell over Manhattan the way it always did in the final week of the year. Thick and silent, blanketing the glass towers of the financial district until the whole city looked like it was holding its breath. Inside the crystal atrium of Sterling Dynamics, a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars, the air was warm and sterile, filled with the quiet hum of power. A woman in a tailored charcoal suit stood at the center of that atrium, her heels striking the marble floor, with the precision of someone who had never once doubted her own authority. She looked at the man standing before her, a stranger in a worn winter coat, and set her gold wristwatch down on the reception counter with a small, deliberate click. "You have exactly 60 seconds to disappear," she said. The man did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply nodded, reached into his coat, and made a phone call that lasted exactly 7 seconds. No shouting, no begging, no threats of any kind. 7 minutes later, every phone belonging to the executive board began ringing at once. 10 minutes after that, it was the woman who had given the order who was asked to leave the room. And what silenced the entire building, what turned confident laughter into stunned disbelief, was the true identity of the man in the old coat. Somewhere above the atrium, on the 42nd floor, a wall of glass offices watched the falling snow settle over the city. Indifferent to the small drama unfolding below, unaware that within the hour, every one of those offices would be thrown into quiet chaos. Sterling Dynamics occupied 11 floors of that tower, employed close to 3,000 people across 4 continents, and had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating an image of untouchable stability. Nothing about that particular Tuesday suggested it would become the single most consequential day in the company's recent history. And yet, by evening, every person who worked inside those walls would understand that the version of Sterling Dynamics they thought they knew had quietly stopped existing sometime around 11 o'clock that morning. His name was Ethan Carter, and on that particular morning he looked like nobody of consequence at all. He was somewhere around 40 years old, with the kind of face that blended into a crowd, tired eyes, a plain gray scarf, and a leather document case that had clearly seen better decades. He walked through the revolving doors of Sterling Dynamics carrying nothing but that case and a folded appointment slip in his pocket. And within seconds, the young woman at the front desk had already decided who he was. She assumed he was a courier who had wandered into the wrong lobby, or perhaps a job applicant who had shown up without understanding the dress code of a company that measured its worth in the thousands of dollars per square foot of marble beneath its feet. A security manager named Daniel Reeves approached him within moments, his tone polite but firm, informing him that deliveries were handled through the rear entrance and that visitors without proper credentials were not permitted past the front desk. Ethan simply said, "I have an appointment," his voice calm and unhurried, without a trace of irritation. Nobody believed him. The receptionist glanced at her screen, found no obvious record under the name he gave, and exchanged a look with Daniel that said everything words did not need to. It was at that exact moment that the elevator chimed and the executive team descended into the atrium, led by a woman whose reputation preceded her into every room she entered. Victoria Hale was 37 years old, and in the 11 years she had spent climbing toward the chief executive position at Sterling Dynamics, she had built a legend around herself. Brilliant, ruthless, immaculately composed, and famously intolerant of anything that resembled wasted time. She had grown accustomed to boardrooms bending to her presence, to junior staff straightening their posture the moment she walked past, and to a version of respect that came less from admiration and more from fear. When she noticed the small commotion near the front desk, she paused, and Daniel quickly briefed her in a low voice, explaining that an unidentified man was refusing to leave despite having no verified appointment. Victoria studied Ethan for a long moment, taking in the coat, the scuffed shoes, the plain document case, and something in her expression hardened into the particular contempt she reserved for anyone she judged unworthy of her attention. "You have exactly 60 seconds to disappear," she said, loud enough for the entire atrium to hear, and the words landed like a verdict rather than a request. A ripple of laughter moved through the gathered staff. The kind of laughter that comes easily when everyone in a room has decided together who deserves to be humiliated. A junior analyst near the elevators pulled out her phone, angling it toward Ethan, already imagining how many people might see the footage of a stranger being thrown out of one of the most powerful buildings in the city. Somewhere near the security desk, the closed-circuit cameras kept recording, indifferent to the cruelty unfolding in front of their lenses. Capturing every second with the same flat, patient gaze they had turned on 10,000 ordinary Tuesdays before. Ethan did not flinch, did not raise his hands in protest, did not offer the pleading explanation that everyone in that atrium seemed to expect from him. He simply looked at Victoria the way a man looks at weather he has already prepared for, something to be waited out rather than fought. And in that stillness there was a quality nobody in the room quite knew how to read. The 60 seconds Victoria had granted him ticked away in silence, and when they expired, Ethan finally moved. Though not toward the door, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a plain black phone, the screen unremarkable, the case scratched from years of use. He dialed a number from memory without needing to check it, lifted the phone to his ear, and spoke 2 short sentences that nobody in the atrium would understand the weight of until much later. "It's me," he said first, his voice low but perfectly clear. Then, after the briefest pause, he added 4 words that would soon detonate quietly through the entire financial ecosystem surrounding Sterling Dynamics. "Execute Protocol 7, he said, and then he ended the call. The entire exchange lasted 7 seconds, no longer, and for a moment, the atrium remained exactly as it had been, full of quiet laughter, gets dark, and the low murmur of people who believed they had just watched a nobody get put in his place. For a brief moment, the atrium held 2 entirely different realities inside the same space. One visible and one not. In the version everyone could see, a stranger had been humiliated and had responded with a pointless, almost comic phone call, before presumably slinking away in defeat. In the version only Ethan understood, a mechanism 20 years in the making had just been quietly set into motion. One that no amount of apology or backpedaling would be able to stop once it began. He had built that mechanism carefully, layering safeguard upon safeguard into the architecture of Sterling Dynamics, precisely so that it could never be dismantled by a single impulsive decision, not even one of his own. Somewhere inside him, a small and unwelcome part recognized the strange symmetry of the moment, the fact that the very system he designed to protect the company from careless leadership was now about to expose exactly that flaw in the person leading it. Victoria allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The kind of expression that comes from a woman certain she has already won, an argument nobody else realized was happening. A few employees had already begun filming, angling their phones to catch the tail end of the confrontation, eager to share a story about the strange man who had wandered into the wrong building and called someone in a desperate, empty gesture of defiance. Nobody in that lobby understood that 7 floors below the earth, in a private operations center, known to almost no one at Sterling Dynamics, a bank of monitors had just flickered to life. A senior operations director sat up straighter in her chair the instant an old, dormant authorization code appeared on her terminal, a code she had been told, years earlier, to never question if it ever surfaced. Within moments, a team of attorneys in a different part of the city received a simultaneous alert on their secured devices, and a separate team of financial strategists, working 3 blocks away, began pulling files that had not been touched in over a decade. None of them needed further instruction. They had clearly been waiting. The operations center itself was located 7 floors beneath street level, accessible only through a private elevator that required a separate biometric key most employees at Sterling Dynamics did not even know existed. Inside, a senior operations director named Patricia Nolan had spent the past 11 years maintaining a system she had never once been permitted to explain to anyone outside a very short list of names. When the authorization code appeared on her terminal that morning, she felt her pulse quicken. Not from fear, but from something closer to anticipation. The sense that a long-dormant contingency had finally been called into action. She lifted a secure phone from its cradle and began making calls of her own, each one brief, each one carrying the same quiet urgency, that Ethan's original 7-second call had carried. Within 12 minutes, a coordinated sequence of financial and legal actions had already begun moving through channels that Victoria Hale, despite her title, had never been granted access to. The first sign that something had shifted arrived quietly, almost invisibly, the way true catastrophes often do before anyone recognizes them for what they are. Sarah Bennett, the chief financial officer of Sterling Dynamics, felt her phone buzz in her blazer pocket as she stood near the elevators, and when she glanced at the screen she saw an email subject line that made her stomach tighten instantly. It referenced an emergency credit review, something she had never once seen triggered in her 6 years with the company. And beneath it was a request for immediate verification from 3 separate banking partners. Moments later, James Whitfield, the company's lead attorney, received a call that stopped him mid-sentence in a conversation with a junior associate, his expression shifting from mild irritation to visible alarm within the span of 10 seconds. Across the atrium, the head of human resources, a composed woman named Diane Foster, went noticeably pale as she read a message on her tablet. Her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through lines she clearly had not expected to see that morning. Within 20 minutes, 3 separate banking institutions had reached out to Sterling Dynamics, demanding urgent verification of the company's current standing, and one of them, without further explanation, froze a line of credit worth several $billion, pending confirmation of internal authority. Victoria, still standing near the reception desk, noticed the sudden flurry of activity around her but initially dismissed it as unrelated, an unfortunate coincidence of timing that had nothing to do with the man she had just ordered to leave. She told herself the frozen credit line was likely a routine audit, the kind of bureaucratic hiccup that happened occasionally in an institution of this size. And she turned her attention back toward the door, expecting to see Ethan already gone. Instead, she found him standing exactly where he had been, patient, unmoving, his eyes following the visible unraveling of composure spreading through her staff with something that might have been sadness rather than satisfaction. He said nothing further. He did not need to. Word of the frozen credit line spread through the upper floors of Sterling Dynamics with unusual speed, carried not through official channels but through the nervous whispers of assistants and junior executives who sensed that something larger than a routine audit was unfolding. A marketing director named Rachel Simmons found herself unable to reach 2 of the company's largest external partners by phone, both of whom had abruptly rescheduled meetings that had been confirmed only days earlier. In the legal department, James Whitfield paced the length of his office twice before finally sitting down, staring at a document referencing an internal governance clause he did not recognize and had never once been shown during his 4 years with the firm. Nobody could say with certainty what was happening, and that uncertainty proved far more unsettling than any clear catastrophe could have been. By early afternoon, the mood throughout the building had shifted entirely, the earlier laughter in the lobby now feeling, to those who remembered it, distant and faintly embarrassing. It was only in the following hour that the deeper truth about Sterling Dynamics began to surface, a truth that even senior members of the executive team had never fully understood. The company had always projected itself publicly as an independent financial powerhouse, self-made and self-governed, a monument to Victoria's leadership and the talented team she had assembled around her over the years. In reality, Sterling Dynamics had never truly been independent at all. Its entire structure was quietly underwritten by a private investment fund, so carefully shielded from public view that most employees, including many on the board, did not know it existed. This fund never appeared in press releases, never sent representatives to industry conferences, and never listed its shareholders in any public filing anyone could easily access. And yet, buried within the original founding documents of Sterling Dynamics, that same fund held something far more significant than money. It held ultimate veto power over every major decision the company had ever made. Victoria had heard whispers of this arrangement early in her tenure. Vague references passed between senior partners in hushed voices. But she had never personally met the person behind the fund, and over time she had come to treat the whole matter as something closer to corporate folklore than fact. She had been told, briefly, during her earliest days as an executive, that the company's original founder had stepped back from public life more than a decade earlier, vanishing so completely that some employees eventually stopped believing he had ever truly existed. Rumors filled that silence the way rumors always do, some claiming he had died quietly overseas, others insisting he had simply lost interest in the business world entirely and disappeared into obscurity. Victoria had absorbed these stories the way she absorbed most things that did not directly serve her ambitions, filing them away as irrelevant background noise, while she focused entirely on building her own reputation. She had never once imagined that the ghost behind Sterling Dynamics might walk through her own lobby on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a worn winter coat. The fund itself, known internally to only a handful of people as the Cavendish Trust, had been structured deliberately to avoid drawing attention, its holdings distributed across a web of smaller entities that made tracing its true ownership nearly impossible for outside analysts. Financial journalists had occasionally speculated about its existence over the years, publishing brief and inconclusive articles that were quickly forgotten in the churn of daily news cycles. A handful of regulators had asked questions during routine reviews, only to receive answers so carefully worded that the inquiries eventually stalled and were quietly closed. Robert Sinclair, the chairman of the board, was one of only 4 people at Sterling Dynamics who had ever been given direct contact information for the fund's founder, and even he had been instructed, years earlier, never to use it except in circumstances of genuine emergency. Nobody at the company, least of all Victoria, understood how close that threshold had come to being crossed on an otherwise unremarkable winter morning. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the falling snow reached the atrium roughly 40 minutes after Ethan's phone call, and within moments, a private helicopter had landed on the emergency pad atop the adjacent parking structure. A group of unfamiliar attorneys strode through the revolving doors first, their expressions grave, followed closely by 3 members of the Sterling Dynamics board of directors who rarely, if ever, appeared in person at the company's headquarters. Robert Sinclair, the aging chairman of the board, entered last, moving with a stiffness that suggested he had been pulled away from something important without warning, his eyes scanning the atrium until they landed on the man in the worn coat still standing near the reception desk. What happened next stunned everyone who witnessed it. Robert Sinclair, a man known throughout the financial world for his icy detachment, stopped in his tracks, straightened his posture, and inclined his head toward Ethan with unmistakable deference. "Gentlemen," he said, turning briefly toward the stunned executives gathered around him, "our founder has arrived." A younger receptionist named Michael Turner, who had only started working at Sterling Dynamics 3 months earlier, felt a small twist of discomfort watching the scene unfold. Though he said nothing, unwilling to risk his own position by questioning the judgment of a woman as powerful as Victoria Hale, he had noticed something in Ethan's demeanor that the others seemed to miss entirely. A kind of unhurried patience that did not match the description of a lost visitor or a confused stranger. Ethan glanced briefly at his watch, an old, unremarkable piece with a scratched leather band, and said nothing further as the countdown Victoria had imposed continued to tick silently around him. Somewhere near the elevators, a group of junior analysts exchanged amused glances, already composing the story they would tell their colleagues later that afternoon about the strange man who had been thrown out of the building in under a minute. None of them noticed that Ethan's eyes had drifted briefly toward the security cameras mounted above the reception desk, the faintest suggestion of familiarity crossing his expression before it disappeared again behind his usual calm. The words landed across the atrium like a physical blow, and for several seconds nobody moved at all, the entire space frozen in a silence so complete that the soft hiss of the coffee machine near the reception desk became suddenly, absurdly audible. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as the pieces assembled themselves in her mind faster than she could process them. The worn coat, the calm refusal to argue, the 7-second phone call that had somehow paralyzed 3 separate banking institutions within the hour. The man she had ordered out of the building in front of dozens of witnesses was not a courier, was not a lost job applicant, was not anyone she could dismiss with a glance and a countdown. He was the person who had built Sterling Dynamics from nothing more than an idea 2 decades earlier, the same man whose signature appeared on the very founding documents that gave him final authority over everything the company had ever become. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, the junior analyst who had filmed the earlier confrontation quietly deleted the footage from her phone, suddenly aware of how differently the video would be interpreted once its full context became known. Michael Turner, still standing behind the reception desk, felt a strange mixture of vindication and disbelief, replaying in his mind the calm patience Ethan had shown throughout an ordeal that would have provoked anger in almost anyone else. Daniel Reeves, who had been the first to approach Ethan that morning, found himself unable to meet the man's eyes. Understanding all at once how completely he had misjudged the situation from the very first moment. Every employee who had laughed minutes earlier now stood in absolute stillness, their phones lowered, their earlier amusement curdling instantly into something closer to dread. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, though no words arrived. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she genuinely did not know what to say. To understand how Ethan Carter had come to stand in that lobby unrecognized, it helped to look back 20 years, to a much smaller office in a much less glamorous part of the city, where a younger version of the same man had built the earliest foundations of what would eventually become Sterling Dynamics. He had started with almost nothing, a handful of employees, a modest loan, and an idea about financial services that most established firms at the time considered too risky to pursue. Over the following years, he grew that idea into something formidable, working relentlessly, sacrificing sleep and comfort in equal measure, until the company he had built finally reached a scale that attracted serious institutional interest. When the opportunity came to sell operational control to a new executive leadership team while retaining ownership through the private fund he quietly established, Ethan made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who knew him. He stepped back entirely, disappearing from public view, choosing to observe rather than command. His reasoning, though never publicly explained, was simple in its logic, even if unconventional in its execution. He wanted to know whether the company he had built could preserve its original values without his direct presence enforcing them, whether the culture he had tried to instill would survive contact with ambition, profit targets, and the slow erosion that often accompanies growth. For years he watched from a careful distance, reviewing reports, occasionally intervening through anonymous channels when something seemed to drift too far off course, but largely allowing the company to evolve under its own momentum. He had watched Victoria Hale rise through the ranks with genuine admiration at first, impressed by her intelligence, her work ethic, and her undeniable talent for strategy. Over time, however, he began noticing something else developing alongside her success: a growing tendency to measure people by their appearance, their titles, their perceived usefulness, rather than by the substance of who they actually were. That tendency troubled him more than any financial metric ever could, because he understood something few executives in Victoria's position ever fully grasped, that the true measure of a leader revealed itself most clearly in how they treated people who could offer them nothing in return. He had watched, through careful and quiet channels, as Victoria dismissed junior employees without a second thought, as she reserved warmth only for those whose influence might benefit her directly, as her definition of value narrowed further with every promotion she earned. There had been earlier signs he chose to overlook. A canceled contract with a small vendor whose owner had shown up to a meeting in modest clothing, a round of layoffs that disproportionately affected employees without powerful advocates in the building, a pattern of impatience toward anyone who could not immediately articulate their usefulness to her, in financial terms. Each incident on its own seemed small enough to excuse the ordinary friction of a demanding industry, rather than evidence of something deeper, and for years Ethan told himself the good Victoria had accomplished still outweighed these smaller failures of character. It was only in the months leading up to that snowy December morning that he finally admitted to himself the pattern had become too consistent to ignore any longer, and that the company bearing his name deserved a leader who valued people as much as she valued performance. The morning he walked into Sterling Dynamics wearing an old coat and carrying a worn document case was not an accident or a coincidence. It was, in fact, the final and most direct test he intended to give her, a deliberate choice to appear exactly as the kind of person Victoria had shown, time and again, that she considered beneath her notice. What followed in that atrium was not an accident either. It was the last data point Ethan Carter needed. Within the hour, the board of directors convened an emergency session in the largest conference room on the top floor of Sterling Dynamics, its windows offering a sweeping view of a city still blanketed in falling snow. Every member of the executive team was required to attend, including Victoria, who walked into that room with none of the composure that had defined her public image for years. Robert Sinclair opened the session by playing footage recovered from the building's closed-circuit cameras, beginning with the earlier confrontation in the lobby and continuing through several other incidents that had, until that morning, gone entirely unaddressed. The footage revealed a pattern that none of the board members present could easily dismiss. Moments of casual cruelty toward junior staff, dismissive treatment of visiting clients whose appearances did not match Victoria's expectations, procedural shortcuts taken whenever convenience outweighed her patience for proper protocol. Each clip was accompanied by a brief written summary prepared by the legal team, outlining the reputational and operational consequences that had quietly accumulated as a result. Victoria attempted several times to explain her actions, insisting that decisiveness had always been essential to her success, and that the incidents shown represented isolated moments rather than any deeper pattern of behavior. Nobody in the room directly contradicted her, yet nobody offered support either, and the growing silence around the long conference table spoke louder than any argument could have. Sarah Bennett, seated near the middle of the table, finally broke the silence by pointing out, carefully, that the company's public reputation had already begun suffering as the footage from the lobby circulated more widely than anyone had anticipated. Diane Foster added that the Human Resources Department had received an unusual number of internal complaints over the past year, complaints that had been quietly filed away rather than escalated, out of what several employees later admitted was fear of retaliation. Robert Sinclair listened to each account without interrupting, his expression unreadable, occasionally glancing toward Ethan as though gauging his reaction before allowing the discussion to continue. It was Ethan, seated quietly at the far end of the table, who finally spoke. His voice measured and free of anger despite everything that had happened only hours earlier. He did not demand Victoria's resignation, did not list further grievances, did not raise his voice even once throughout the entire meeting. Instead, he asked a single question that settled over the room, like a weight nobody quite knew how to lift. "What does a chief executive actually represent?" he asked, looking directly at Victoria as he said it. And for a long moment, nobody in that room offered an answer. Later that same afternoon, once the initial shock of the meeting had begun to settle, Ethan asked to speak with Victoria privately in a smaller office down the hall, away from the pressure of the assembled board. He began, unexpectedly, not with criticism but with a story from his own past, describing a period roughly 20 years earlier when he had been rejected by more than 200 different investors while trying to secure funding for the earliest version of Sterling Dynamics. He described walking into meeting after meeting wearing whatever clothing he could afford at the time, often dismissed within minutes by people who judged his potential based entirely on his appearance rather than the substance of his ideas. If even one of those investors had treated him the way Victoria had treated him that morning, he explained calmly, Sterling Dynamics would never have existed at all, and none of the people currently employed within its walls would have the careers they now depended on. Victoria listened in silence, something in her expression shifting as the weight of his words settled over her, the realization arriving slowly but unmistakably that her greatest failure had never truly been a matter of poor decision-making. Her true failure lived somewhere deeper, in the quiet assumptions she made about people before she ever gave them the chance to prove those assumptions wrong, in the reflexive contempt she reserved for anyone who did not immediately signal wealth or status through their appearance. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Victoria Hale apologized, and this apology carried none of the practiced diplomacy she typically used in public statements or shareholder meetings. It was quiet, unpolished, and entirely without performance. Offered not to protect her position as chief executive, but because she genuinely understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what she had done and to how many people she had likely done it. She thought, in that moment, of every visitor she had dismissed with a glance, every employee whose name she had never bothered to learn, every small act of contempt. She had allowed herself simply because her position gave her the power to do so, without consequence. None of those people had ever been given the chance to prove her wrong the way Ethan had, and the thought settled over her with a weight she found difficult to carry. Ethan did not offer easy forgiveness in return, nor did he pretend the apology alone repaired anything meaningful. He simply nodded, acknowledging what she had said, and told her that real change would need to be demonstrated over months and years, rather than declared in a single conversation. When the board reconvened the following morning, the majority position among its members favored Victoria's immediate removal, arguing that the reputational damage from the leaked footage alone justified swift and decisive action. Ethan, however, surprised nearly everyone present by arguing against her dismissal, offering a perspective that few in that room had considered amid their focus on optics and liability. He reminded the board that justice was rarely served by the swiftest possible punishment, that true accountability required a person to sit with the consequences of their actions long enough to actually change because of them, rather than simply disappearing into a settlement and a quiet resignation. Firing someone is easy, he told the assembled board members, his tone calm but firm. But changing someone is far more difficult and far more valuable when it actually succeeds. He proposed an alternative path forward, one that would require Victoria to remain with the company, but under an entirely different set of conditions than she had ever operated under before. She would undergo extensive retraining focused specifically on interpersonal leadership, would be required to spend regular hours working directly with frontline staff and clients, rather than remaining isolated in executive spaces, and would personally oversee a complete rebuilding of the company's internal culture from the ground up. Robert Sinclair objected initially, arguing that shareholders would view any leniency as weakness. But Ethan reminded the board that he still held final authority over decisions of this nature, and that authority, rarely exercised, would be exercised now. Several board members exchanged uncertain glances, unaccustomed to watching Robert Sinclair yield so completely to another person's judgment, yet none of them chose to challenge the decision further. Victoria, seated at the far end of the table, said nothing during this exchange, aware that her future had just been decided by two men, discussing her as though she were both present and somehow absent from the room at once. When the vote finally concluded in her favor, narrowly but decisively, she felt neither relief nor triumph, only the sober recognition that she had been given something she had not earned and would now have to work to deserve. Victoria accepted these conditions without hesitation, a response that surprised several board members who had expected resistance from a woman known throughout her career for guarding her authority fiercely. Over the following weeks, she began appearing in parts of the company she had rarely visited before, sitting alongside customer service representatives as they handled difficult calls, standing behind the reception desk during particularly busy mornings, listening to employees whose names she had never previously bothered to learn. It was uncomfortable at first, and she struggled visibly with instincts that had been reinforced over more than a decade of climbing toward power through control rather than connection. Slowly, however, something in her approach began to shift, the rigid detachment softening into something closer to genuine curiosity about the people who made up the company she led. Ethan observed this transformation from a careful distance, offering guidance when asked but never dictating her choices. And gradually, a quiet mutual respect began to develop between them, built not on hierarchy but on the shared understanding of what real change actually required. 6 months later, Sterling Dynamics recorded the highest client satisfaction ratings in its entire history, a statistic that surprised industry analysts who had expected the earlier scandal to permanently damage the company's public reputation. Victoria had changed in ways that extended far beyond boardroom strategy, personally greeting visitors at the front desk on her way to meetings, remembering the names of employees across every department, and instituting new company policies that explicitly prohibited judging clients or staff based on appearance rather than substance. Michael Turner, the young receptionist who had once watched silently as Ethan stood accused in the lobby, found himself promoted into a junior management role after Victoria personally noticed the quiet integrity with which he treated every visitor who walked through the doors, regardless of how they were dressed or what they carried with them. Daniel Reeves, the security manager who had first approached Ethan that morning, later admitted in a private conversation with colleagues that the incident had changed how he evaluated every person who entered the building afterward, no longer relying on appearance as a shortcut for judgment. Sarah Bennett noted in an internal review that client retention had climbed steadily throughout the year, a trend she attributed less to any new financial strategy and more to a simple, measurable shift in how the company's staff treated the people they served. Even Robert Sinclair, never a man prone to sentimentality, remarked privately to another board member that he had not seen the company operate with this much genuine cohesion since its earliest and hungriest years. During the company's annual recognition ceremony held that winter, exactly 1 year after the incident that had nearly ended her career, Victoria stood before the entire staff of Sterling Dynamics and spoke publicly about what had happened in the lobby that snowy December morning. She acknowledged the humiliation Ethan had experienced at her hands without minimizing it or offering excuses. And then she said something that many in attendance would remember for years afterward. "That 7-second phone call did not destroy my career," she told the room. Her voice steady despite the emotion clearly present beneath it. "It saved who I actually am as a person," she continued, and the room remained completely silent as she spoke, absorbing words that carried none of the polished detachment her earlier public statements had always contained. Ethan stood near the back of the room throughout her remarks, dressed once again in a simple coat, unremarkable among the crowd, exactly the way he preferred to remain. When Victoria finished speaking, their eyes met briefly across the room, and something passed between them that needed no further words, an understanding built slowly over months of difficult, honest work, rather than granted easily through forgiveness alone. Afterward, the two of them walked together toward the same atrium where everything had begun, standing quietly near the spot where a wristwatch had once been placed on a counter beside an ultimatum. Outside the towering glass windows, snow continued falling gently over the city, the same steady winter snow that had blanketed Manhattan exactly 1 year earlier on the morning of their first encounter. This time, however, neither of them felt the cold the way they once had. Victoria looked out at the falling snow and thought about how close she had come to losing something far more important than her position, something she had never even realized she was in danger of losing, until a stranger in a worn coat forced her to confront it directly. Ethan thought about the company he had built 2 decades earlier, about the values he had always hoped it would carry forward long after his own direct involvement ended, and about the quiet satisfaction of watching those values take root again after nearly disappearing entirely. Neither of them spoke of the incident as a punishment any longer, and neither of them needed to, because both understood by then that it had never truly been about punishment at all. It had always been, from the very first ticking second of that 60-second countdown, about the slow and difficult work of becoming someone worth the power one already held. What the story of that snowy morning ultimately revealed, long after the headlines faded and the footage stopped circulating, was a truth far simpler and far more enduring than any boardroom drama or corporate scandal. Real power was never found in the ability to make another person disappear within 60 seconds, no matter how much authority or wealth stood behind such a command. Real power lived instead in the quieter, harder choice to offer someone the opportunity to become a better version of themselves, even after they had done something that seemed unforgivable in the moment it happened. Ethan Carter had spent 20 years building an empire, but the choice he made in that lobby, the choice to answer cruelty with patience rather than retaliation, ultimately mattered more than any dollar figure the company would ever report. And Victoria Hale, who had once believed that respect was something to be commanded through fear and status, finally understood that the truest measure of her success would never appear on any balance sheet at all. Years later, when new employees joined Sterling Dynamics and heard the story of the man in the worn coat for the first time, they often assumed it had been exaggerated somewhere along the way, softened into legend the way workplace stories tend to be. Those who had actually witnessed it in person, however, needed no embellishment to explain why the story still mattered, why it was still told during orientation sessions why a small brass plaque near the reception desk quietly commemorated the exact spot where a wristwatch had once been placed down beside an ultimatum. The plaque bore no name, no date, and no explanation beyond a single sentence that Victoria herself had chosen for it. It read simply that everyone who walks through these doors deserves 60 seconds of genuine attention before being judged at all. Beneath the falling snow that continued to blanket the city each winter, the lesson remained exactly where it had begun, quiet, unassuming, and far more powerful than anyone in that lobby could have predicted on the ordinary Tuesday morning it was first learned.